What we need to accept is that Putinism and Trumpism share ideological DNA. They are two versions of the same global ideology, a kind of monarchist consumerism that makes might into right. Now let's be clear, there are some parts to Putinism that are specific to Russia, so these are things that are not going to come your way. And the main one of these is mysticism. Let's put it bluntly. Putin's ideology is shopping plus fascism with a mystical twist. There are three strands to the Kremlin's mysticism. Number one is defeat as the starting point. Russia only wins if it begins as a loser and then leaps from the back row to the front row of nations in one dramatic swoop. Number two, fate without progress. A belief in preordained destiny but detached from any modern idea of progress. Number three, self-annihilation as triumph. An element, just an element, of thrill in self-annihilation. Now note, these guys in the Kremlin are much more nihilistic than Soviet leaders ever were. Trump shares the shopping and the fascism with Putin, but he does not share the mysticism. What he does share with Putin, however, far outweighs what divides them. And we're going to break this down into three ideological pillars. The first of these pillars is the F word, fascism. Fascism is not a theory, nor is it a unique product of 20th century history, as The Rest is History podcast would have you believe.
You don't think it's a fascist?
No, I don't. I think fascism is a time-specific thing that comes about in the debris of the First World War.
Fascism, like any ideology, is a stance toward politics. As a political philosopher, I've thought about this for a quarter of a century, and it's my feeling that we could use about 7 traits to estimate the presence of fascism in society. What we're going to do together is take Trump and Putin and rank them according to each of these traits on our ideological intensity scale. Here is how the scale works. 0 to 2, the ideology is absent. You might say 2 out of 10 is not absent, but actually it is, because we are all implicated a bit in all the ideologies that are there in our culture, because ideologies are fluid. So under 2 we're not going to count. 2 to 5 are signs of ideology that are present. 5 to 8 is defining features present. And 8 to 10, you are ragingly an expression of a particular ideology. The first feature of fascism is revolutionary conservatism. Radical change in the name of a mythical past. Fascism borrows a bit from socialism, the revolutionary element, and a bit from conservatism, the idea of a return to a past that never was. Quick aside, this is why it's embarrassing for Mr. Jordan Peterson to call German fascism socialist. It's a misunderstanding of the fluid nature of ideology. It's a bit like arguing that a roast chicken is an omelette. Now, both Putin and Trump are high on revolutionary conservatism. Think the MAGA slogan and think Putin's absorption with the mythical past, something we discussed in our video on the Putinist myth about Crimea. Let's give Trump 6 and Putin 8 on revolutionary conservatism. Putin scores very highly, but he doesn't get a 10 because the element of public mobilization is missing. Neither Putin nor Trump are out there creating mass movements like the Nazis or the Soviet communists. Let's move on to the second trait, the politics of enemies. Fascism perennially widens the category of the enemies within. First it's one group, then another, until a very large number of citizens are called the enemies within the state.
I think the bigger problem is the enemy from within.
Look at the way Trump attacks civil servants, the media, the so-called deep state, non-citizens as enemies within, and increasingly, citizens will be next. Meanwhile, Putin can't even imagine political opposition as legitimate. For him, it's always a foreign plot. So we're going to give Trump 7 and Putin 8, not higher, because there is an absence of this element of public mobilization. Let's move to the third element, and that's that action under fascism becomes an end in itself. Under fascism, action becomes proof of truth. You can make a wrong action right by performing it with virility. If I add an ingredient to your cake, that becomes proof that it belongs there.
Chocolate.
No, Marmite.
At the extreme, violence is no longer a tool. It becomes an end in itself, and we land on the aesthetization of politics a la Leni Riefenstahl. Now let's look at Putin, because Putin collapses legitimacy into mere power. One of his central oppositions to Navalny was that Navalny had no power. Why do I have to deal with you? I have power and you don't. And Trump is a post-truth actor for whom doing X or saying X can make X right. Both Putin and Trump aestheticize action, but they don't go as far as the Soviets or the Nazis. So we're going to go Trump 6 and Putin 7. There is also the element of fascist kitsch. In Russia, it's represented by the Z symbol and by the singer Shaman, who dresses up as though he were at a rally in Germany in the 1930s. Kitsch facilitates emotional denial and lowers the barrier of entry. I don't have to do any big F stuff, I just have to walk around with some symbols and flags. A fourth trait of fascism is to treat the state as a semi-spiritual organization. For fascists, institutions vanish into a mystical state. Because the state is semi-spiritual, it is totalizing. The leader is equated with the state and the state is equated with the people. Putin gestures at this. He thinks he is Russia. But he is also obsessed with a procedural legalism that makes him sound very un-fascist when he speaks. For instance, Putin would not typically order the killing of his enemies. He would more likely say that the functions of particular agencies can be extended to be commensurate with the latest threats. Trump, especially after the assassination attempt, has flirted with the idea that he is America, but it's not gone very far in his case.
My life was saved
Yet.
for a reason. I was saved by God to make America great again.
Now, because this category requires public mobilization, both Trump and Putin are going to have moderate scores. Trump gets 3 and Putin gets 6. The fifth fascist trait is the cult of the leader. Leader equals state equals people and dissent equals treason. While Putin thinks he embodies Russia, he avoids pushing the cult of leadership too far. Portraits of Putin are an embarrassment in Russia, and indeed Putin is okay with that. Trump does not believe he embodies America, partly because he doesn't believe much. He only has 3 or 4 steady thoughts at a time. But he does think that opposing him is un-American. So on the cult of leadership trait, we're going to give Trump 6 and Putin 7. The sixth fascist trait is the importance of the inexpressible. Fascism distrusts analysis. Overthinking kills organic political life. Under fascism, law is the expression of the organic energy of the people, the state, the leader fused into one. You could argue that Putin's mysticism is fascist, but I'm skeptical about that. Fascism is very modern, and its partial denial of modernity via romantic notions of the inexpressible is itself a homage in reverse paid to modernity. On the other hand, Putin's mysticism is not very modern. It's a sign of a country in which only the high culture has gone through the Enlightenment. So where else is there fascist inexpressibility in Putinism? It might be found in the place where citizens say that they are outsourcing politics to Putin and that they don't know his reasons for action, except for the fact that they hope he has good reasons to do whatever he does. There is a kind of functional mystification of the reasons for action in your political system. And we discussed this in our video on what Russian soldiers invading Ukraine actually feel. Trump is too transactional for mysticism, but the element of the outsourcing of power to a political leader whose decisions you don't need to understand is there with him. So on the inexpressible, we're going to go Trump 4 and Putin 8. The seventh trait of fascism is a permanent emergency. Fascism thrives on unending crisis. The crisis never ends, and that justifies everything. A permanent emergency is in place until a new world is warded in. For Putin, Russia is in a permanent struggle, assailed by enemies. Trump's USA is also in trouble, and he is the emergency savior.
Very bad people. We have some sick people, radical left lunatics, and I think they're and it should be very easily handled.
But the mobilization element is missing in both. So we're going to go Trump 5 and Putin 8 on permanent emergency. So how fascist are Trump and Putin? Putin scores 6.6 on fascism and Trump scores 5.1. Both have defining fascist traits. Putin is more fascist than Trump, but neither Trump nor Putin are raging fascists because the mobilization element is missing. Some scholars, like the marvelous Marlène Laruelle, argue that Putin cannot be a fascist because this element of public mobilization is missing. But this is an elementary misunderstanding of what ideology is and how fluid ideologies are. Now, just because I'm a political philosopher does not mean I'm any good at giving these scores. I've given these scores directionally to guide you in the direction of seeing certain emphases, but I want you to give your own scores. So, this was the first pillar, fascism. Let's now turn to the second ideological pillar holding Putin and Trump together, and that is monarchism. The first and central trait of monarchism is that it says that the leader is the sole source of political legitimacy. Legitimacy flows not from law or from procedure, but from the fact of the leader's personal power. Russia's political system is entirely in orbit around Putin, and his power is seen as self-justifying. Meanwhile, Trump cannot see how a legitimate objection can be made against anything he does. So Trump gets an 8 and Putin gets a 10 on leader as the sole source of legitimacy. The second trait of monarchism is a state of emergency. Monarchism, like fascism, normalizes a state of emergency. The leader is entitled to use emergency powers to save the nation. Putin rules Russia as though it were under permanent existential threat, and Trump wants to establish emergencies whenever it suits him and longs for sweeping powers. So Trump is going to get an 8 and Putin is going to get a 9 on state of emergency. The third trait of monarchism is rejection of institutions. Monarchism sees courts, parliaments, media as insupportably impersonal obstacles to the leader's personal power. Loyalty to institutions is replaced by loyalty to the leader. Putin has hollowed out institutions in Russia and largely runs a mafia-like regime. Trump consistently attacks institutions, but he hasn't succeeded in destroying them. So we're going to give Trump 9, and we're going to give Putin 10 on rejection of institutions. The fourth trait of monarchism is a false rejection of ideology. Monarchism says the leader is above faction and ideology, which is a comically ideological position. Putin mixes post-truth and mysticism to justify his rule, and Trump runs on "I alone can fix this." So we're going to give Trump 8, and we're going to give Putin 9 on false rejection of ideology. The fifth trait of monarchism is that the leader represents a demobilized population. The people do not march with the ruler, they just outsource legitimacy to him. Indeed, getting overly political and claiming your public freedom can endanger your private freedom, your opportunities to provide for your family or to go shopping. Putin keeps raising the political temperature, but he fundamentally depends on the majority of the Russian population remaining depoliticized. Trump thrives on people tuning in casually and half-distractedly endorsing him while getting on with their private life. So on depoliticization, we're going to give Trump 8 and Putin also 8. So how monarchist are Putin and Trump? Trump gets 8.2 and Putin gets 9.2 on our ideological intensity scale. Both Putin and Trump are raging monarchists. Let's now turn to the third ideological pillar uniting Putin and Trump, hyperneoliberalism. Hyperneoliberalism is what happens when neoliberalism mutates. Neoliberalism, putting a magical primacy on the market, gives way to a politics that no longer distinguishes power from authority. Politics becomes competition without solidarity, and might comes to be seen as right. Ironically, that erosion undermines the very technocratic administrative state in which neoliberalism depends. The historical chain of causation runs something like this. From neoliberal depoliticization to the collapse of solidarity. Neoliberalism strips politics of meaning and citizens give up on collective goods and common projects. Then we go from collapsed solidarity to atomized competition. Citizens see themselves as only isolated competitors. Then we go from atomized competition to might as right being seen as the only arbiter of conflict. Outcomes of competition are decided by mere power, and when power alone decides, it veils itself in the cloak of authority. So people go from saying might is right is inevitable to saying might is right is appropriate. How hyper-neoliberal are Putin and Trump? I'm going to give Putin 11 out of 10, beyond raging. As Greg Uden says, for Putin, war is just neoliberalism's logic, played out with tanks instead of balance sheets. That's what I mean by hyper-neoliberalism. We're going to give Trump 9 out of 10. Trump's hyper-neoliberal imperialism threatening allies and neighbors with annexation is still mostly at the level of intent rather than execution. So thank you so much for bearing with me through these 3 pillars of Putinism, or as we can call it now, monarchist hyper-neoliberalism, or fascistized monarchist hyper-neoliberalism. Let's review the total scores. On fascism, Trump is 5.1 and Putin is 6.6. On monarchism, Trump is 8.2 and Putin is 9.2. On hyper-neoliberalism, Trump is 9 out of 10 and Putin is 11 out of 10. Both are clearly fascistized hyper-neoliberal monarchists. Now, this is not only about Trump in the West. We could run the same experiment with many post-truth populist authoritarian leaders. Orban, Johnson, Le Pen, Farage, you name it. If we extended this analysis, we would see that the entire ex-conservative populist right in the West is an expression of the same ideology. They are not, in the first instance, perpetrators or victims of malign foreign interference from Russia, which is real. They are domestic political products. And unless we admit this, unless we see that this is convergence and not infection, we will keep losing to these ex-conservative authoritarian right populists. That's why the question, how do we stop Russian interference, is really important, but secondary. The more important question is, how do we stop our political systems from mutating into something that looks like Russia? Because unless we do this, our ballot boxes in the 2030s will not just bring us more Trumps. They'll bring us more hard-nosed and disciplined authoritarians here to usher in democratic collapse. But of course, it gets much worse than this, because Trump is not just a hyper-neoliberal monarchist. He also has a personality disorder. His unchecked narcissism is destabilizing global politics, and he is dependent for narcissistic supply on Putin and other tyrants who are enemies of the West. We have to talk about that, and to understand it more, watch this video next.